Yeah. Look, since what you asked before, I'm sure it's on my blog. I've been asked a number of times in the last few weeks about the guide, chapter 2, part 2, chapter 25, where people say that the Rambam holds that if Aristotle's view of the universe were proven true, we would reinterpret the Torah to agree with it. That's dead wrong. It's not even partly right, it's not even hopefully right, or imaginatively right, or virtually right. It's just dead wrong. I wrote an essay in which I explained this in great detail. It's not a friendly essay. I did it as a logician with proofs and with precise scriptural references and all the rest. But I want you just to know what the background is. And you can look, I believe it's on my blog. You can look up Gottleib, Guide 225. It should come up. The Rambam there says that the difference between Aristotle and Plato in their view of the universe is that for Aristotle there is nature, the universe has no beginning, the laws of nature are absolutely necessary, nothing other than what happens could happen. When he talks about God, little g, that God also can only do what he does, cannot do anything else, there's no freedom, there's no creator. That's Aristotle's view of the universe. One big important implication is there are no miracles. Everything is natural. Plato holds that in addition to God, there's prime matter, which exists independently of God and has always existed. And God informs that prime matter in any way that he pleases. Can make it into the type of world we see today, we can remake it into a different world. Laws of nature are only due to the way in which he happens to be informing the prime matter at the present time. And therefore, miracles are possible. Now the Rambam says, one of the sources of truth that we are committed to, without question, is Jewish tradition, including Scripture. Whatever it says, that's what we believe. We believe other things also, but whatever it says, that's what we believe. The question is, what does it say? To understand what it says, you have to be able to know how to interpret it. There are rules for interpretation. Certain types of non-literal interpretations are acceptable under two conditions. First of all, there has to be pressure to reinterpret, and second of all, the reinterpretation must conform to certain standards. If either of those conditions is met, we don't reinterpret. If we don't reinterpret, then we take the literal interpretation, and that is the truth, capital T, period. Okay, now, Aristotle's view that the world is run by necessary nature and there are no miracles, in order to reinterpret, if you had a proof of it, that would be a motivation to reinterpret the Torah. Motivation. But there are certain rules beyond which you can't go in reinterpreting. And reinterpreting the Torah to fit Aristotle goes beyond those rules, and therefore it's not acceptable. Plato, if you had a proof of Plato, says the Rambam, we would reinterpret because the reinterpretation that's necessary to accommodate Plato doesn't go beyond the rules of acceptable interpretation. For that, he compares reinterpreting the Torah to avoid anthropomorphism and physical description of God, and we do reinterpret it for that reason. And there are hundreds of physical descriptions of God, and we reinterpret because those reinterpretations fall within the standards of acceptable reinterpretation. In particular, if you want to use a word in a non-literal way, if you want to say that a word, instead of having its literal meaning, in this passage has meaning Q, you have to find some other passage in which the word clearly means Q. You can't invent the new meaning to fit your preconceived ideas to what the Torah should mean. You have to find a passage in which it definitely means Q, and then you could say, if it definitely means Q over there, I'm entitled to reinterpret the passage over here. That type of reinterpretation is used for avoiding the physical descriptions of God, and could equally be used to reconcile Plato's view of the universe with the verses of the Torah, the Tanakh. And therefore, if there were a proof of Plato's view, you would have a reason to reinterpret, and the reinterpretation would be within the acceptable bounds. And that's what you would do. For Plato's view, Plato, Plato, 2 syllables, not Aristotle with 4 syllables. But, says the Rambam, word for word, if there were a proof of Aristotle's view, that would be a motivation to reinterpret, but the type of reinterpretation of all the passages that refer to miracles, and to reinterpret them if they're not miraculous, goes beyond the acceptable standards of interpretation. So we would not reinterpret. What would we do? The Rambam says we would go to other things. Full stop. We'd go to other things. The best I understand what the Rambam means here is this. If you have 2 sources of truth, which you regard as both absolutely authoritative and they contradict, you're in deep trouble. You're in deep trouble. You would have logic providing the proof that Aristotle is right, and you would have scripture saying that he's wrong, and you would be in deep trouble. And he doesn't speculate what we would do. He just go to do other things. In the case of Plato, why do we reject Plato's view of the universe? Not because there's any logical fault in it. We reject it because there is no proof of it. Since there's no proof of it, there's no motivation to reinterpret. If there's no motivation to reinterpret, you don't reinterpret. And therefore, the strict literal verses say that the existence of a prime matter going back independently, infinitely back, is something which the verses reject. Since the verses reject it, it's wrong. So we reject Plato on the grounds that the verses say he's wrong, and there's no motivation to reinterpret. We reject Aristotle on the grounds that there's no proof, so there's no motivation, and reinterpretation is absolutely impossible. Were there a proof of each one, the outcome would be very different. If there were a proof of Plato, we'd reinterpret because the reinterpretation is acceptable, it's within the acceptable bounds of reinterpretation. And were there a proof of Aristotle, we'd give up. We'd just give up. That's what he says in 225. It's not even controversial, it's not subtle, not based on tricky translations from the Arabic. Those are what the words say. I've done this, I believe it's on my blog, you can look it up, where I've done this in great detail, citing each word and each paragraph and the logic and the rules of interpretation. It's all laid out there in great detail. Great people have made this mistake. Friedlander, whose translation I think is, I don't know all the translations, but of the English translation is certainly better than the ones that I know. But he makes this mistake in the introduction. He says this, it's just wrong, it's just dead wrong. Okay, now it's time for questions, yeah.
I was wondering if you can personally try to answer as many why layers deep. Why do you do that which you enjoy? And then whatever your answer is, ask why and answer one more time, and then maybe a second time, as far as you could.
I don't think there's one answer. I mean, there are different types of pleasures. They're done for different types of reasons. So I don't think that there's one answer. The point about pleasure, and not only pleasure, other things as well, is that it is an acceptable stopping place for the why questions. And it works like this. Of course, there is this tendency. Mature people gave it up when they were 11, but there are a lot of immature people. They say, why A? Is it because B? Well, why B? Because C. Why C? And it's just why? Is it 10 o'clock yet? Why Q? R, ha. Why R, ha? Not stopping to think, is it reasonable to push on always and forever? Is the why question always pressing? Does this why question perhaps need a justification? Or is it just free? What's the status of why questions? Now, for example, if I ask why A, and I know that things like A can be caused by P, Q, and R, and there are 3 choices, and I ask why A, that's a pretty reasonable question because there are 3 different things that cause A's, and I want to know which one it is, so I'd like to know which one it is. But that isn't always the case. Something has to be done to show that the why question is a legitimate question to which it's appropriate to at least try to find an answer. You may not find one, but to try to find an answer. Sometimes, some types of answers can be a full stop because there's no alternatives that you can press onto the situation. So I'll give you an example. You know, the person's working at a job. Why are you working at that job? To earn money. Why are you earning money? To buy a house. Why are you buying a house? To live in it. Not all houses you buy, you live in. Some you buy for investment and sell to somebody else. So there's two or more possibilities here. You're asking which of them, or maybe one I don't know about, is right. So he says, no, to live in it. Why do you want to live in it? Because I'll enjoy it. Why are you going to do what you enjoy? You know, are you sober? No? What are you injecting lately? You're asking me why I'm going to do what I enjoy? That's just what I do. Sometimes I just do things that I enjoy. Not doing it for something else. Here you're not forced to say, well, enjoyment is either A, B, or C, and you have to tell me which one it is. No. Sometimes enjoyment is just for itself. That's the kind of thing that enjoyment is. So it's not always justified to keep asking while expecting an answer. By the way, moral obligation has the same structure. You see me handing a guy $500, say, hey, is this free $500 day? Can I have some also? No, you don't understand. I borrowed money from him. Aha, I borrowed money from him. So what? So I said, well, I borrowed money from him, so I owe him the money. Yeah, and? Well, when I owe people money, then I pay it back. Aha. Why do you pay back money that you owe? Sorry, because I owe it. That's why I pay it back. Now, it didn't have to be the answer. It could have been because I want a good reputation, because I want to be able to sleep at night and have a good conscience and so on and so on. But it doesn't have to be. It's perfectly acceptable and understandable to say, in my motivational scheme, that's the top of the ladder. That's the top of the ladder. You could do that in other cases, but then there'd be something wrong. Why are you working at that job? Well, at the end of the week, I get these rectangular pieces of paper with the 1, 0, 0, the green ones, you know. That's what I get at the end of the week, the pieces of paper. Why are you going after the pieces of paper? I just go after them. That's what I do. I just go after rectangular pieces of paper. USD on them, you know. D doesn't mean dairy, it means dollars, you know. So that's what I do. I just go after those pieces of paper. What do you do with them? I pile them up at home. I have a giant pile of them. And every time I work for a week, I get another pile on the top. Something wrong with that. Because the value of dollars is that they buy things. And this person just piling up rectangular pieces of paper, there's something seriously wrong. He doesn't know what they're for, or he's got a screw loose somewhere. Right? So then there you could be upset and say, sorry. That's either it's not true or you're in trouble. But that's not true when the person says, I did it for this because I enjoy it, or I did it because it was obligatory. And there's a third type. I'm not going to go into some more detail, but there's a third type, I think, which is independent, because I have a certain picture of the kind of person I want to be. And by doing this, I'm going to become that or express that. It's my ideal. Right? Why do you have that ideal? Go get a cup of coffee. Leave me alone. Right? It's not a pressing question. It doesn't have to be answered. It might be that I have it for literary purposes or something else, but it doesn't have to be. Whereas if you ask why I'm working at a job, there are a zillion reasons why a person work at a job. And liking the job is a reason. It's an answer to the question. The person says, why are you working at a job? He said, I just do. There's something wrong. There's something wrong. Okay? I think this is plain and obvious. This is not theoretical, it's just plain and obvious.
I was asking because I was wondering if you can answer, I do that which I enjoy because that's how the Creator wired me.
Oh, but I think that would take it outside the scope of the type of question we're asking. You ask me why I do something. Well, one question you're asking is, what is my motivation in doing it? What am I trying to achieve? You're now moving to a different dimension. What reason do I have for doing what I'm doing? That's an entirely different dimension. In particular, even if I don't do it, I could have a good reason for doing it. It just doesn't move me. So one is what actually psychologically moves me to act, and the other is what conditions are there that make it appropriate to do. Those are two different dimensions. Philosophy of action wasn't my major field of study, but I did learn a little bit. Yeah.
So you said that every pleasure every pleasure's source, it's a mitzvah, right?
Every pleasure is, I'm not getting the words.
Every pleasure's source, it's because of a previous mitzvah. That
Oh, the Rambam. Because the Rambam, the pleasure
I think
that
the
you
Rambam
experience
supports
is,
with-
right.
So I wanted to ask if when a person makes an avera and gets pleasure from it, is that somehow affecting his olam haba? Like what's the consequence of getting pleasure, which in that straight definition would be that it comes from a previous mitzvah? Would that affect the let's say the schar for the mitzvah in olam haba? Like what?
Why don't you ask the question without saying it came from a transgression? Just ask if you get pleasure for a mitzvah in this world, for a mitzvah, but without coming from an avera. Just if you get pleasure in this world, does that detract from your reward in the next world? Why doing it, getting it from a forbidden act changes the question?
Well, because like how is it that an avera is in the realm of pleasurable things, since the source of pleasure is a mitzvah? That's the
No, see now, that's why your words before, that's why I stopped with the words before. A person gets any kind of pleasure, it's not that it's the mitzvah that causes it, God rewards him by giving it to him. You can call it cause if you like, but it's not the immediate physical cause of it. The pleasure that you get for doing a mitzvah, the mitzvah could have been 10 years ago. It's not that doing the mitzvah causes the pleasure, and doing the aveiros causes the pain. You have a record of actions, some mitzvahs, some pains. The mitzvahs give you a certain credit for pleasures, and the pains give you a certain liability to the transgressions, give you a certain liability to pains. And then pleasures come to satisfy that merit, and pains come to satisfy that liability. It's not that the action causes it that way.
right. But then the question is, so why actually a person is capable of enabling pleasure in an action, even if it comes from a previous mitzvah? I hear this. But how is it that actually through that action that is forbidden, there will be, like, that's just what I'm...
But I don't see why it's a question. Once you realize we're not saying that the forbidden action causes the pain,
Yes.
and we're not saying that the mitzvah causes the pleasure. So now, why is there a problem about a forbidden action happening to cause the pleasure? It's a free thing. It's non-significant. It's only if you thought that the mitzvah caused the pleasure and the forbidden action caused the pain that you would find it peculiar that this forbidden action causes the pleasure. When you see that that's not what's going on, so I don't see what the problem is.
Well, then just stretching it a bit more, perhaps, it's one of the, let's say, weapons that the Yetzer Hara counts, that it makes you believe that the pleasure comes from doing...
It could very well be, and indeed, if forbidden actions never caused pleasure, you'd never have any motivation to do them, and you wouldn't have any free will choice. Right? So you could just say that God plans it that way so that we'll have a free will choice to choose the bad, the good over the bad. Yeah.
So a few months ago, Ben Shapiro, they're a religious political commentator, they wrote a piece called Modern Orthodox Moral Failure, which one of the points they made is how modern Orthodox classifies hard-to-justify positions, such as halachas concerning women or homosexuality, as choks in order to justify such laws, calls this chokification. I'm curious, is there a proper distinction between chok and other types of laws, like mishpatim? And if so, what is that distinction? And how would such issues fall or not fall into it?
That's a very interesting thought on his part. I have not aware of that. I do follow him somewhat.
He wrote it in Jewish press. It was like a few months ago. I didn't realize until recently, actually.
In other words, by styling these mitzvahs as a chok, if you thought a chok were a mitzvah without a reason, then all the objections that you would have against it wouldn't be directly relevant, because objections are only against reasons which you think are inappropriate, they're false, or they're misleading, or they're not used logically, or so forth and so on. But if it's designed to be a mystery, then okay, you have reasons against it, but it's not designed to answer to reason. That's what he's doing. He's avoiding the confrontation in that way. It's a clever thing to do. He is a clever fellow. I think his Jewish education could have been.
He's not making the position. He's calling out modern Orthodox people who make the position.
I understand.
Oh,
I
okay,
understand. Yeah, I understand. So now, Chok, according to, I would say, all commentators, but if not all, then the vast majority, is something whose reason is hard to discover. Not something that doesn't have a reason. The Rambam, the Ramban, the Ran, the vast majority agree that even the Chok has a reason. There are books written to give reasons for all the commandments, like the Sefer HaChinuch, which goes through all 613. Doesn't stop at the ones that are called Chukim. There are many mitzvahs called Chukim in the Rambam, and it doesn't stop there. Other sources in Chazal and other commentators that talk about the reasons for the commandments. So then it's only a relative distinction, it's not a distinction of principle. Some things, for example, the paraduma, the red heifer, which is called hachok, chukas haTorah. There's a medrash that says that Solomon, whom some call the wisest of all men, yeah, just some, Maimonides denies it, but okay, said, I said I will be wise, but it's far from me. I was not able to figure it out. But the Medrash says that Moshe Rabbeinu did know the answer, and that in the future, when the earth is full of the knowledge of God, everyone will know the answer. So there is an answer. And what that Chazal means is only that using your human wisdom together with all the resources of the Torah, you're not going to find it. It requires prophecy to find it. Okay, but it is there, does exist, just you're not going to find it this way. Even that, which is called ha-chok, the chok, has a reason. So I know the Gemara brachos, some of the different aveiros. Okay, look at the Rambam there, look at the Ran there, and there's parallel mission in Megillah, and you'll see that you don't have to read it the way you've been taught to read it. At any rate, so I don't think that there's a fundamental distinction there. Now, having said all of that, certainly no mitzvah has the answer to our logic. And if a reason is given for a mitzvah which your logic rejects, there are two things to say. First of all, it's almost guaranteed that's not the only reason. And second of all, now I should be, I guess, cautious in saying this, but it is conceivable for you to consider, 1 minute out of every year that your logic could be wrong, ill-informed, subjective, prejudiced, even the things which are so obvious that if you deny them, you'll be canceled. Even those could be wrong. So I think that the fact that it disagrees with your logic doesn't necessarily speak against it. Maybe it speaks against you. Yeah.
Just on that last point, saying that your logic could be wrong, just out of interest then, going back to the original point you were discussing today then, with the Aristotelian philosophy contradicting what we learn in the Torah, would you not then apply the same point, just say, even though it seems correct, would say the logic is wrong?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, if I had to try to reconcile, but the question is, I'm sorry, I've got to calibrate this thing. If I don't calibrate it, it won't work later. Where is it now? It's now at 150, about 170. Let's try 175. I'll just say a little bit about this. This is quite interesting. As I mentioned to you, the Rambam, and I think many, certainly medieval thinkers, thought of there being three sources of knowledge which are absolutely authoritative. One is some kind of exercise of logic, and one is your religious tradition, and one is sense perception. Now, if you had a contradiction between two of them, you'd have a contradiction of your two out of your three most serious, most important sources of knowledge. You might flip a coin or try to guess which one was wrong, but you'd be in serious trouble. Suppose that if there were a verse that said that every night when you go to sleep, the whole world disappears, and it only reappears when you wake up in the morning. I think you'd say, yeah, but there are people up all night, and they don't report anything like that. And what you see and what you feel and what you smell are direct sensory modalities, and they deliver to you very reliable knowledge. And so the tradition to deliver very reliable knowledge, I think you'd have a crisis. You have a crisis. Now we today, because our attitude and experience of what's called logic is different. Things change, and we discover paradoxes and contradictions of it and so on. But if you lived in a world in which the basic ideas of basic logic lasted, let's say, for 1,000 years, I think you feel differently about it. If I had a proof based on that kind of reasoning, which everyone for 1,000 years has credited as solid reasoning, then I think, and then I had a verse that contradicted it, we'd be in very serious trouble. If you want an analogy, let's take the proof that there's an infinity of primes. A fairly easy, simple ancient proof to the ancient Greeks. That proof has been in existence, 2,300 years. Countless millions of people all over the world have learned it from every culture and every political system and every social system, and they all are totally convinced. Now imagine in your mind we discover it's really not correct. What would you do? I think you'd be in trouble. I think you'd be in serious trouble. If that could be wrong, then what else do I know? What else can I count on? A fairly elementary mathematical proof which convinced the world for 2,300 years could be wrong? You'd have to seriously rethink all of your standards and your hierarchy and what relies on what. You'd be in serious trouble. And for the Rambam, since things were stable like that, I'm just giving you an example of what's stable for us, right? If that had to be, or if sense perception started to go down the hill, if half the time you remembered where you put something, it wasn't there, I think you'd begin to wonder about your sanity or your mental abilities altogether. Half the time? Half the time? And things appear out of nowhere? What would you trust in what you believed? There's certain things which are so deeply rooted that if you consider discarding them, everything goes to pieces. That's one of the reasons that people give that it's not appropriate to consider discarding them. One way to answer the skeptic. Maybe you're wrong about everything. Well, then I'll be wrong about being wrong also. Anyway, okay, that's enough to your philosophy tonight. Yeah.
I heard and read that in Halakha you're not allowed to read any heretical works unless it's to disprove them, and also you have to make sure that you're not going to be swayed by their arguments. So it seems to me that means that you are not allowed to go into a book, with the belief that my beliefs might change. You have to say, my beliefs are not going to change, and now I could read this book. So my question is, how do you know what you believe to be true is true? Maybe you're going to be swayed by the non-Jewish rhetoric and arguments. Maybe you're already swayed by the Jewish rhetoric and arguments. How do you know if you haven't seen both sides?
I guess one way to answer that question is to ask what the source of your belief is. Now, suppose here's an example that I give for other purposes. I'm attached to Einstein. I've studied his theories, and I'm pretty good at them, so on. I travel with him. He gives lectures, and when people ask questions, I answer them as best I can. We're in China, and suddenly, to my shock and surprise, Einstein gives his lecture in Chinese. Wow, Albert, I didn't know you could speak Chinese. Ha ha, you don't know me well, he says. Okay, and he gives the whole lecture in Chinese. Halfway through, somebody grabs my arm and says, "Is what Einstein just said true?" Well, let's see now. I don't speak Chinese. I don't understand Chinese. I don't know what he said. I'll still answer that it's true, because Einstein said it. I don't understand it at all. I have no clue what he said. But it's a physics lecture, and he's the greatest physicist in the world, and he said it. I'm betting it's true, even if I don't understand it. If I believe what I believe on the basis of an authority which I think can't be trumped, then I'm not afraid that someone's going to give me an argument, which is going to, because he's not as big as the authority that I took it from. And that being the case, that even if I don't see how to answer him, I know he's wrong.
What about the authority itself, right? Atheism and Judaism are polar opposites.
They're not authorities, they're theses. I'm talking about the person from whom you get it.
Look, I don't know, there's no person, it's your upbringing.
Well, Oshikan and Shalom depends on who the people who brought you up and taught you, what sources did they have, what sources did they use, right? Our sources go back to prophecy. Prophecy goes back to Sinai, right? And my attitude is, if you give me something that's a proof that I can't answer against Sinai, so I know it's wrong, I just can't figure out why. I'll give you another example. In the mid-1940s, a terrible problem in perception was discovered. Your retina is two-dimensional. You see a three-dimensional world. How do you do that with a two-dimensional retina? You have two-dimensional information about a three-dimensional world. How do you perceive a three-dimensional world? That was a difficult problem. Nobody thought, well, I guess we've discovered that we don't perceive a three-dimensional world. It really is two-dimensional. Nobody thought that. Why not? I have a proof that you can only have two-dimensional information because this piece of your tissue is only two-dimensional. But it's just obvious. It's not so, right? So then you say, okay, so we'll have to try to figure it out. So not always when you have an argument you can't answer must you give in. It depends on what the argument you can't answer is arguing against. Zeno, my favorite example, Zeno proved that nothing moves. Nothing moves. He had 3 proofs that nothing moves. It took 2,300 years to answer him. No one in the 2,300 years thought, well, if we don't know how to answer, maybe nothing moves. Why not? Because the proof isn't as strong as what you know that it moves. So you'll bet that the proof is right. It's not prejudice. Every time you have a proof to a conclusion, that sets up a struggle between the nature of the proof on the one hand and your resistance to the conclusion on the other hand. And in many cases, it's right to favor your resistance to the conclusion against the argument. Arguments are sometimes wrong. Arguments are often wrong, especially when they're abstract arguments about unfamiliar subject using unfamiliar concepts and so forth and so on. So I don't think that you would have to be necessarily in that position where you'd be afraid that you would be persuaded.
Isn't that the halakha that if you're afraid they will be persuaded, then you're not allowed to read it?
But you didn't ask that. You asked why it isn't reasonable to be persuaded. You didn't ask whether you have a psychological weakness. That wasn't your question. And I think, by the way, that although you have correctly identified 2 reasons, there may be other reasons as well. Hare, reading works of Avodah Zara, is also in that class. And the Rambam himself says, based on the Gemara, how would you be in the Sanhedrin and Paskin, a shaila in Avodah Zara? Shall I kill him or not if you didn't know the Avodah Zara? Obviously, you have to study it. So that's not the only reason, because of knowing what to answer and so forth and so on. Devekus is another reason, but in order to paskin shalos on Avodah Zara, you have to know the Avodah Zara. Chazal say that Avraham Avinu had 400 mesechtes of Avodah Zara because he lived with them, and they were all different, and he had to decide when shall I buy and when shall I sell, 3 days before, 3 days afterwards, the whole thing. So of course he had to study all of those systems of Avodah Zara because he couldn't live a practical life, a halachic life without that. So I think that. Okay, that's enough to answer the question that was raised.
Does it make a difference if the thing that you're reading challenges those convictions? So let's say, you mentioned before, the work I'm reading is 101 arguments against Judaism, or why the Kuzari is wrong.
Yeah.
The work specifically challenges those convictions. Would it make a difference then?
It depends on who you got it from. Here's this guy who calls himself the second son. Who's the second son at the Seder? Russia. That's his title, the second son. Okay, and he wrote a whole book called Breaking the Kuzari. Kuzari is my argument. He wrote a whole book of Breaking the Kuzari, right? Now, let's take Yankel, right? This guy is a frum guy who went off the derech. And he's writing about it. And the Kuzari is being presented by someone who was a professor of philosophy, in particular the field of logic, and published a book with Oxford University Press, and he's a professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, which is one of the greater universities, right? Is it likely that this guy is right? And then Gottlieb is wrong? Probably not. Probably not. So I think he could say, even if I can't figure out how to answer this guy, still my bet is on Gottlieb, because his intellectual authority is much greater than this author. So I think he could say, therefore I'm not afraid of being persuaded. Actually answered a large part of his book, page by page. Yeah.
The idea that we have in Yiddishkeit of striving, I guess, for ideals such as being devoted to Torah and not being devoted and not spending time on other things, not indulging other pleasures or interests, as much as necessary, we say, okay, as much as is necessary to allow you to serve Hashem, so you eat, you drink, you engage in pleasure, have fun, but only purely as much as is necessary, and the ideal is to abstain as much as possible and be purely focused on, the spiritual, Ruchnius. How does that work with the idea that Judaism is the one religion that does not view the physical and the pleasure as a mistake, like a quote-unquote mistake to be avoided as much as possible? It's something we're supposed to embrace. So how does that fit with the idea of trying to mitigate our involvement with it?
It's a very good question, and most of the answer comes in changing your formulation of the facts. The idea is not to minimize the physical because it's physical. The idea is to maximize the spiritual because it's spiritual. And instead of seeing these as competing concerns where each one encroaches on the other and each one subtracts from the other, we envision the spiritual as embracing everything. The spiritual is 24/7, 365, no time off. So when you're eating and when you're sleeping and playing basketball, it's all spiritual. It's not time taken away from the spiritual. You should minimize as much as possible. It's all spiritual. When it's all spiritual, then it's all good. The only time when it won't be good is when you can't impose spirituality on those pursuits, including physical pleasure, which you said correctly. That as much as is necessary for serving God, that's what we're supposed to do. That because then when you're doing this to be able to serve God, doing this is also spiritual. Ramchal defines serving Hashem as having two categories. One is mitzvos, and the other is everything that you have to do in order to be able to do mitzvos. All of them are called serving Hashem. The Rambam says exactly the same thing in Hilchos Deos. That means serving Hashem, and that's all Ruchni. If you're serving Hashem, then it's all spiritual. So there's no time off. But then, since you need to eat, you need to sleep, and you need a certain amount of physical pleasure, the sources are clear on that. See the end of the first chapter of the Mesilas Yesharim. Yeah, the Mesilas Yesharim says you need physical pleasure. You just don't remember that passage because it's not stressed in yeshiva. All that means that it's all spiritual. So embracing the physical as physical, that's dumb. That's like embracing rectangular pieces of green paper with 100 USD written on them, right? Of course, physical pleasure is a means. What, is it an end? You're alive in part to have pleasure? That's what justifies what you do, that it's pleasurable? That certainly is not our view. Right? That would be as if you were a cow. Right? You have a soul. And some want to say you are a soul. It's a little complex, but you have a soul. The soul is capable of much higher things, and but it's sort of like having a soldier, and he has a gun with bullets. And he says, "Why should it have bullets?" Well, sometimes I like the rhythm. I like the rhythm. I shoot what I'm shooting at is arbitrary. I just like feel the rhythm of the bullets going out. Right? And say, sorry, that's not a responsible soldier. There are serious things to be done here. So the attitude towards the physical is that it's embraced to the extent to which it can be spiritualized, and spiritualized includes using it for a genuine intrinsic purpose. The pleasure is not a genuine intrinsic purpose. Yeah, who are we going? Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to understand a bit better our idea of the Bekut.
Yeah, the idea of the what?
The idea of the Devekus,
Devekus, yeah.
because there is a reference that says, from what we learned, that retreat from all sorts of things, it's actually kind of a condition that enables that Devekus. So I mean, I'm wondering, like, why is it not like a more applied things in the nowadays life?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Even the Rambam talks about his bodhidus. I hope that doesn't shock the people who are breast lovers or anti-breast lovers. Rambam talks about secreting yourself, sequestering yourself for periods of time, be away from other people and other distractions, so you can focus solely on Kodesh Baruch Hu. We are learning this together in the Rambam Shir. That he says the precious moments on your bed before you fall asleep, when you're all alone, there's nothing to, and then you can meditate on God undisturbed. I would like to hear Aristotle write about the precious moments before you fall asleep. He wasn't on that wavelength. So I think you're right. I think that a certain amount of that kind of being alone is very important. In a certain sense, if it was done correctly, Shemona Esrei is like that. Shemona Esrei, you're standing there, you're saying your words, you're saying them silently, nobody's listening to you, and you're not going to answer the cell phone. Somebody taps you on the shoulder, you're not going to respond. You are really in isolation. It's just you and Kodesh Baruch Hu. So if we use that time for a kind of meditation, that would be something like that. But I agree with you. Time alone, time to be unconnected is a valuable thing. How much and when, what conditions and what to do, it all could be discussed. But I agree with the general point. I think that some people ask me, how can you feel God's presence? So I have a suggestion. Every day, do a mitzvah that nobody knows about but you. Nobody knows about it but you. And it's just between you and the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Nobody else knows about it. Every other thing you do in public, you have your reputation. People are going to record what you do. They're going to think about you in one way or another. You play to the audience. Do something that nobody knows. Say some Tehillim. Don't tell anybody. Don't, bring it up in the shir. Oh, I know. In Tehillim, Ayin Tes. That is what it says. How do you know? I know. Don't get anything personal out of it. Don't get any benefit out of it. Just do it because the Kodesh Baruch Hu wants it done. That's one way to do it. But I agree. That kind of seclusion is an important thing. Yeah.
Though you stated your opinion on these matters several times, such as evolution and things like the flood and other things, I'm curious whether or not these things are compatible with a specific Torah worldview, particularly evolution or things we taking not so literally pre-Abraham, such as some of the creation, other things. I know people who make these arguments, such as evolution be compatible, typically say people like Rav Chok and others. And I'm curious the response, or if there are other figures who endorse a compatibility between these positions with particular.
So I haven't studied this in detail. Ernst Mayr wrote an essay. He was a professor at Harvard, an expositor of evolution. In this essay, he says the word evolution has at least 5 different meanings. In the Western English evolution literature, it has at least 5 different meanings. So the first thing I would ask is, what do these Torah sources mean when they say the word? There was a 19th century German naturalist who said, evolution is as clear as the earth goes around the sun. So people read that, they say, he must have been nuts, all these debates about natural selection and random mutations, so on and so on. He meant change. Things have changed. That's as clear as the earth goes around the sun. Dig up the bones and you see that they've changed. That's all he meant. Evolution meant change as opposed to stasis. Okay, so you have to know what the person means. And I think it'll be quite difficult to ferret out from the writings of Rav Kook or from Rav Hirsch or others what exactly they meant by the word evolution. The second thing is, what do they mean by compatible? Very often, some people, I'm not talking about Rav Hirsch and Rav Kook now, I haven't studied this subject in detail, but many people who talk about the compatibility between evolution and religion think of religion is the 5 books of Moses. Or maybe the first chapter of the 5 books of Moses, or something like that. But that's utterly unimportant to us. We have a gigantic tradition with thousands of pages of material. Some of it has its origin in the oral tradition, and some of it has its origin in later authoritative studies. For us to reconcile evolution with Jewish religion would mean to reconcile evolution with thousands of pages of material. I don't think, these other people who talk about making it compatible are going beyond the first chapter of Genesis. And the first chapter of Genesis without any commentaries. In the English translation, maybe even the King James translation. Okay, maybe not. At any rate, I find it a ill-defined exercise, and given what I know about evolution, what I know about our sources, if you take both of them seriously, it's hopeless. It's absolutely hopeless. Yeah.
So I've often encountered the idea of nothing really objectively existing in and of itself, meaning out independently of God. As we believe everything is just constantly, you can almost say, just really being projected there by God. It's not like this table exists, independently, objectively this table exists independently of God. No, it's something that God is making appear here in our physical world. This whole physical world is just...
That's right.
All matter is just stuff God is quote-unquote projecting there.
That's right.
One time in discussing this concept, I was told that this may be believing that everything is just God is maybe a form of Avodah Zara and maybe incorrect. Oh my
goodness gracious! You beautifully described a position which is very, very widely accepted, maybe universally accepted, and then in the last sentence you move to an entirely different formulation. But up until the last sentence, you didn't say everything is God. You said everything is what God projects. That's right. The Rambam writes, in existence there are only God and what he creates. That's all there is. Okay. That doesn't mean the things he creates are him. If I bake a table, the table isn't me and I'm not the table. Why should they be God? That's an entirely different description, which at best could be poetry, which have to be reinterpreted in terms of something else. Of course, God isn't partly wood, partly metal. You can't burn up part of God. I mean, it's not, nothing about God can be in space. Only physical things can be in space. God is not physical at all, not even a little bit, not even on Sundays.
but then, if these are not in fact him, they're things he created outside of him, then did he not just create things that are independently?
No, you answered that at the beginning, because he's constantly creating them. He's just projecting them all the time. But if A projects B, B is not A. A is a projector, and B is a projection, and they're not the same. One is an agent, and the other is the thing that receives the agency. They're of course different.
What is that projection made of, though? Is that not...
It's made of whatever he made it made of. He made the ingredients that he put into it.
And do those ingredients exist outside of him, independently of him? Are you saying
outside and independent aren't the same. Don't use them as if they were the same. He can project their existence outside of himself, but they depend upon him, because if he would stop projecting, they would stop existing. And that's exactly what the Rambam says in the very beginning of the guide of the Mishnah Torah. And everybody else says it too. So the first part that you said is certainly 100% correct. Yeah.
What's the rationale behind the idea? What's the reason given?
I guess it depends on what you mean by rationale. This is an interesting question. The Ramchal in the Mamar Allah, oh boy, I forgot the name of it. I'll think of it. He wrote a Mamar on this question, and including this question, and there are 4 different editions of it, and it's not in all the editions. He asked this question. Kodesh Baruch Hu certainly could have created things that would then exist independently of his supporting them, independently of his continuously creating them. There's no, and he says there because there's no limit to what God can do. You can't tell me that God couldn't create something that was independent, so why not? Who's to limit him in that way? So he asks, why didn't he do it? I'm going to say something prejudicial now. The Ramchal is a philosopher. That's his true definition. He asks questions that only philosophers ask. And he gives answers that only philosophers ask. You've heard of the four worlds? Ramchal says there are only three, not four. The Ramchal is astonishing. I've spent a lot of time learning Ramchal. At any rate, so he asks, why does God continuously remake the world? And his answer is a Ruchniistic answer. Not a metaphysical answer. It's a metaphysical question. It's a Ruchniistic answer because, as you said before, the purpose of our lives, our existence is Devekus, to form an attachment. And if he weren't available to us, it would be impossible to have an attachment. So he has to be available to us. And the way in which he's available to us is that his will sustains everything that exists. So we are surrounded by the results of his constant operating will, and that's what makes him available to us to attach to him. That's why he does it that way, not for a metaphysical reason, which expresses the unity of Jewish thought. You know, he said, well, it's a metaphysical question, it's got to get a metaphysical answer. No, it doesn't. You can get a ruchnistic answer, get a value answer, you can all have a boy answer. Everything's connected to everything else. Everything serves everything else. It's not compartmentalized that way. But that's the way he asks, and he says specifically that, I think it's called. He says specifically that God can do anything he wants, and that being the case, can't be that he couldn't do it. And then on the next page, he talks about the idea of God creating something equal to himself, and he says, that's impossible. The next page, just after he said, of course he can create things that are independent of himself, because he's all powerful, because he can do anything, right? The next page he says, of course he can't create something that's equal to himself. Can't do that. And the answer is very simple, because the idea of creating something equal to himself would mean creating something that's uncreated, because he's not created. And that's a contradiction. We don't tolerate contradictions. The Rambam says that word for word. The Rambam says that word for word. We don't tolerate contradictions. Why we don't is an interesting question. I haven't got time to go into that now, but then you can ask me next Monday.
I would just suppose, because it's not even, like you said, it's not even a question. You're asking.
That's right. But the idea of creating something that continues to exist without God's support isn't a contradiction. Creating something uncreated is a contradiction.
Yeah.
Right. So in the one case, he says God's all powerful. No reason why he can't do it. And you have to give an explanation for why he doesn't do it. And over here, you don't have to give an explanation because it's an open contradiction.
You're not asking a question.
Right. So you've heard what I've said about that. Yeah. Last question, because I have to count sphere and then I have to go. Yeah.
Regarding the why, aside from Skar V'Einesh, then we have a moral obligation to serve God, seemingly.
100%.
So why is that? Is that because of gratitude that he created us, or just a philosophical?
Well, I wouldn't contrast those two things. That's very philosophical. I'll tell you in one sentence. I have a whole long exposition of this, but I'll tell you in one sentence. The Rambam says that we are created with the ability to know the difference between good and evil. Parak Hay in Hilchos Tshuva. Good and evil there means good and evil principles. What's good and evil in practice depends upon factual information. Also, we may not have the right factual information, including his existence and his commands. But the principles of good and evil we know, and we make our choices through free will, and those principles can be used to determine what is good and what is evil, when you have the right information. And the fact that something is good is, and there's nothing else competing with it, with all the conditions, is a reason to do it. Moral qualities are reasons for action. They don't rely on something else to be the reason for why they are reasons for action. There is an end to the reasoning process. And one way to see this is this. Someone says, why should I be moral? And I would question him, what kind of answer are you looking for? Are you looking for a moral answer why you should be moral? Or are you looking for a non-moral moral answer, that you should be moral. The non-moral answer would be, you'll get rich, you'll be happy, you'll live longer, you'll be healthier. You don't want that kind of answer, right? You don't want to see morality serving something else, right? But you want the moral answer? Why be moral? Because it's moral. End of story. Morality is a self-sustaining system. It doesn't lean on something outside of itself. Essentially, moral qualities are reasons for action. If you had a moral concept and it didn't provide a reason for action, it wouldn't be truly a moral concept. That's what they are. So the question dissolves into nonsense. That's one way to say it. Okay, I've got to count here, then I have to go.